Hi, I'm Annelise Laughlin, and I'm here to present you with the research that I submitted to be a Falvey Scholar. And I'm going to bring you through the story map, which I developed with Erica Hayes, one of the resource librarians for story maps and digital humanities in the library. And so this is the product that she and I developed together. So what I want to talk to you about today is the notion of the connection between climate change and conflict, also known as environmental security. So in 2003, the Sudanese government sent an armed militia called the Janjaweed to exact a scorched earth campaign and a genocide in the western region of Darfur, which is over here. What had previously been an intermittent conflict became a military confrontation which killed between 200,000 and 500,000 people, as well as displacing another 2 million. Now, some people call this the first climate war because people believe that climate change contributed to the violence. This violence was preceded by one of the worst droughts in memory, but some argue that climate change wasn't actually the full cause and that military and political events were more important. It's important to note here that climate change is never the sole cause of conflict. However, it can create lasting detrimental changes in the environment, which can stress the social fabric as people compete for ever more scarce resources. And so for my project, I'd aim to establish the connection between violence and climate change, or specifically drought, in Darfur, Sudan. So what you're looking at here is Darfur, and this is just a really small kind of quick overlay of, in the red shading is a death count in the area, and those blue dots are destroyed villages. So you can see where some of these areas down in the west are more prone to conflict. So for this project, I used data from the Climate Research Unit, which was precipitation and temperature data, which I took from the CRU. They're the leading provider of climate data, and you can see where they have these grid boxes. So I selected 9 stations, climate stations from the grid boxes, and averaged them together to get a regional mean for the precipitation in Darfur. I created an anomaly, which is an important element for climate change research because using an anomaly can give you a clearer signal of what's an average temperature or an average rainfall in an area over the course of about 80 to 100 years. I used 100 years of data for my project. And then in GIS, I created a map which kind of took each of the different points that I had selected and kind of created this smooth surface. It's called a raster data set, but what's important is that it takes about 9 discrete points and generates a smooth surface of the precipitation patterns that I was able to look at over the course of several decades. So just some of my results here. What you're looking at is a timeline of the precipitation anomaly in Darfur. I've added a 5-year mean to this anomaly to help give a clearer signal of kind of where these conflicts were, or excuse me, when the conflicts were occurring and what the precipitation looked like at that time. So for this project, we decided that the conflict or the drought begins around 1965, which is here where you can see the precipitation itself really drop, as well as the beginning of the decline in the 5-year mean. And what's important to note here is that although there's intermittent conflict, it's after this prolonged drought, which is obviously kind of this big drop in precipitation below the mean, about 30 years. That's when conflict events become more common and more extreme, which would suggest a connection between the degradation of the land and the violence in Darfur. Just to reiterate this is conflict data from the ACLED data set, which is also overlaid again with that same anomaly that I generated. And you can see where, again, following this drought, as about 30, 20 years pass, conflict becomes more frequent and eventually really intensifies and peaks in the late 2000s. This little blip here is this little blip is the 2003 genocide, but you can see where the conflict has begun to really kind of steamroll, domino effect over the course of 30 years as the stress on the environment becomes greater. So to kind of reiterate this in a different way, this is my kriging map that I developed. And here in this pink, you see this is one of the wetter years on record. And this is what it looks like in 1985. Now, 1985 is one of the driest years on record, but when you compare it to the pink, which maybe the color is a little deceiving, but this was an average kind of year of rainfall. And this is partway through the drought. And you can see where when you zoom in, some of these areas with the higher precipitation or with the lower precipitation are also areas of higher conflict. It's extremely dry here, it's a little drier here. And in those areas, there are more destroyed villages. And as I had mentioned, or as I had wanted to also note, even during some of these wetter years, for example, here, again, some of the dryness is kind of coinciding spatially with the conflict, which again, you really see come out in the dry years. And before the conflict, the rainfall was 37.5% below average, and persisted for decades, and especially in those areas of conflict. So what this tells us is that that long-term drought suggests a continued degradation of the land in Darfur, which would strain the social fabric, and in the instance of Darfur, forced the traditional pastoralist and migratory groups to change their grazing patterns, which then created further resource pressure with farmers. Now, the farmer and pastoralist populations are from different ethnic groups. So in addition to this resource conflict becoming more frequent and the symbiotic relationship becoming more stressed, it was also hardening along ethnic lines, which can help underpin conflict, especially in terms of an us versus them. It's also important to note that the population of Darfur were minoritized by their government, and that the government failed to aid them during two of the worst famines that they had on record. Now that does two things. It erodes government legitimacy by showing the Furs that, no, you don't really matter to us. And that creates motive for insurgencies as well as joining radicalist groups, because suddenly the only way to control your future is to join with these other kind of conglomerate groups who have become more legitimate than the government itself. Which is kind of an instance of where we can see that conflict and drought playing into each other, because as this drought worsens and the government continues to fail to aid them, their legitimacy is destroyed, and instead people are finding their own means to control their lives, to protect themselves. And that's where the insurgency can crop up and become a civil conflict, which is what happened in Darfur. So this drought and the food insecurity that it created by degrading their land and their crops as well as their water resources triggered civil violence from this insurgency, which then caused the Sudanese government to use their Janjaweed militia to genocide the Furian population. And what's important here is that climate change is going to continue altering the natural world, and that will bring different resource competitions, that will create different climate cause scenarios of conflict where government is eroded, governance fails, the social fabric is threatened, and conflict can occur out of that or be catalyzed or intensified. And so as a result, it's very vital that climate change is recognized as a contributing factor in conflict, because then you can begin to study areas that are at risk of disruption, areas that have low governance or low adaptive capacity, and the unrest can be mitigated before it becomes warfare and loss of life. So rather than having conflict after conflict become more intensified, if you can identify those areas ahead of time, you can bring aid, you can teach different farming practices, you can institute stronger infrastructure or better governance practices, and those can mitigate these violent conflicts before they even happen. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Galgano, for helping me with this presentation, as well as Professor Santoro, my GIS professor, who helped me create these GISs for this project. And finally, of course, Erica Hayes, who helped me develop this entire story map in all of its beauty and glory, and its amazing interactive capacities. And I would finally like to thank the Falvey Library for choosing me to be one of the Falvey scholars. Thank you.
So do we have any questions for Annelise? So I'll kick it off with one, because what I'm curious of, Annelise, through this whole process, from what you've learned, do you think, are there other areas in which you are thinking about with the effect of climate change, since this was just one region of Africa? Is it something you think that will apply to other areas?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because part of the way that this environmental security paradigm works is that it's kind of a combination of different factors, things like adaptive capacity, the strength of their governing structures. So, for example, America has pretty high adaptive capacity in many senses, but the Northeast is much more prepared for 18-degree weather than Texas was. And so these kinds of climate shocks can be different. Now, in areas where there's already kind of strained resources, like places that are water scarce, for example, some places in the Middle East, as well as other areas of the Sahel, which is kind of that band around the Sahara Desert. I think those are all places where you could potentially see more severe climate shock simply because they're already in a bit of a stressed environment. So I hope that answers your question a little.
It does, thank you. And you certainly, I don't know if you're reading the chat, but you're getting lots of praise. It was an excellent presentation. So there's a question that's about, what was your favorite part of putting together the story map?
Gosh, well, the whole thing was really fun. To let the cat out of the bag, I'm also a communication major, and I'm really into visual communication. So I think getting to kind of bring together those two skill sets for this presentation was really special to me. It also made it really easy for me to make kind of maps that I hadn't made initially to use in the presentation, and kind of put it all together in a way where I could kind of have it out there for people to look at and read, whenever they chose, and kind of give them the full story.
We have another question about what sparked your interest in this study.
Sure. So the geography department, our geography is in the Department of Geography and the Environment. So kind of as I've been in the department, I kind of come into contact with climate change related issues a lot. And I've always been interested in national security. And so as I was kind of learning about climate change, learning about how some areas are going to be more heavily affected than others, I kind of started to think to myself, well, in areas that are already kind of resource scarce, right? There's already lots of conflict over water between Israel and the occupied territories. I can see how climate change would maybe exacerbate some existing conflicts. So when Dr. Galgano had this kind of research interest in mind, I jumped right on it.
Excellent.